You are living inside a business model that has been running uninterrupted for over a century and a half. The product is conflict. The customer is every government on earth. The profit margin grows every time a bomb drops. 5 families discovered this formula before your great-grandparents were born. They are still collecting. This is not speculation. This is documentation. And by the end of this video, you will see the trap you have been living in your entire life. War is not an accident. It is a subscription service. The moment you understand how permanent conflict generates permanent wealth, everything clicks into place. Your tax dollars, your inflation. The reasons peace never sticks. It is not politics. It is math. And the math has been the same since the Napoleonic Wars. The families who finance both sides of that war realize something breathtaking. You do not need to win. You just need the fighting to continue. The longer the conflict runs, the deeper the debt grows. The deeper the debt grows, the more interest you collect. Peace becomes a loss of revenue. By 1815, the Rothschilds alone had perfected this model. They financed Britain. They financed France. They financed Prussia. Whoever won, they won. Nathan Rothschild reportedly made the equivalent of billions from a single war by betting on bond prices after Waterloo. This was not genius. This was the discovery of an infinite money engine. Every empire since ancient Rome understood one thing. If you can create the need for money during crisis, you control the empire. Roman moneylenders financed both sides of the Punic Wars. Venetian bankers funded the Crusades and then collected interest from the kingdoms that survived. The Medici family became the most powerful force in Europe, not through land or armies, but by financing popes and princes who waged wars for them. These were dress rehearsals, small-scale versions of what was coming. The modern version started when banking families realized they could do something older powers could not. They could operate across borders, while nations fought each other to exhaustion. A family with branches in London, Paris, Vienna, and Frankfurt could finance all sides of a European war simultaneously. Conflict became a portfolio. Winning became irrelevant. The system only required that the war continue long enough to generate sufficient debt. This brings us to stage 1. Creation of dependency. Before a war even starts, governments need to borrow. They issue bonds. Banking families buy those bonds. But here is the lever. They buy the bonds at a discount and sell them to the public at face value. They broker the deals. They set the terms. They skim from both ends. The government now owes more than it borrowed. The bankers collect interest on loans they never actually funded in full. The dependency is installed before the first shot is fired. A 19th century government facing invasion has 2 choices: accept the terms or lose the war. There is no third option. By the time the American Civil War started, this system was already embedded in the United States. European banking houses financed both the Union and the Confederacy. Both sides went into debt. Both sides paid interest. Both sides believed they were borrowing for victory. What they were actually doing was subscribing to a conflict that would pay dividends for generations. Over 600,000 men died. The banks collected regardless. Then comes stage 2, escalation through financing. Once the war starts, the demand for weapons, ships, food, and supplies explodes. Governments cannot pay for this in cash. They go back to the lenders. Each loan compounds the previous one. The debt grows exponentially. But here is where the model gets surgical. The banking families do not just lend money. They finance the industries that supply the war. Steel, munitions, railroads, textiles, shipbuilding. They hold equity in the very companies selling goods to the armies they are financing. They profit twice. Once from the interest on the sovereign debt, again from the industrial contracts. During World War I, J.P. Morgan Jr. financed over $3 billion in loans to the Allies and brokered an additional $6 billion in exports. His firm organized a syndicate of over 2,000 banks. Rockefeller family wealth grew by over $200 million from that single war. Bernard Baruch, who controlled American war industry purchases, made a fortune in a single afternoon. 21,000 Americans became millionaires or billionaires during that conflict. This was not opportunism. This was design. Stage 3 is where the system turns irreversible. Governments cannot stop borrowing because stopping means losing. The enemy is still fighting. The debt has already been issued. The soldiers are already in the field. Retreat is political suicide, so they borrow again. And again. And again. Each new bond issue carries a higher interest rate because the risk has increased. The lenders know this. They price it in. The government is now trapped in a debt spiral that only ends one way: total victory or total collapse. But even collapse is profitable. When Germany lost World War I, the Versailles Treaty imposed reparations so crushing that the Weimar Republic had to borrow just to make the payments. Who financed those loans? The same banking families who financed the war. The Bank for International Settlements was created in 1930 specifically to manage German reparations. The debt became a permanent revenue stream. Germany's collapse in the 1930s created the conditions for World War II, which required even more financing. The cycle repeated. The families behind this are not a conspiracy. They are a cartel. Rothschilds, Rockefellers, Morgans, Warburgs, Kuhn-Loeb, Goldman Sachs, Lazard. These are not shadowy puppeteers. They are publicly documented financial institutions with traceable ownership and interlocking board memberships. In 1913, they helped create the Federal Reserve. The individuals who signed that agreement included representatives of families that had been financing wars since Napoleon. The Federal Reserve gave them the legal authority to issue currency, set interest rates, and control the money supply of the largest economy on earth. From that point forward, American wars were financed through a private central banking system controlled by the same dynasties that had been running this model in Europe for a century. The system was no longer regional, it was global. Stage 4 introduces the Reconstruction phase. Wars end, infrastructure is destroyed, governments are bankrupt, populations are desperate. This is when the real extraction begins. The same banks that financed the destruction now finance the reconstruction. They issue bonds for roads, bridges, ports, and factories. They hold equity in the construction firms doing the work. They control the currencies being used to pay for it all. After World War II, the Marshall Plan poured billions into Europe. American taxpayers funded it through treasury bonds. Banks collected interest. American corporations secured the contracts. The loans were structured so that European nations remained indebted for decades. This was sold as charity. It was actually vendor financing. The banker lends to the government. The government pays the contractor. The contractor is owned by the banker. The circle closes. The debt remains. By the 1970s, the Rockefeller and Rothschild families had established a partnership that spanned 5 decades. In 2012, Rothschild and Company announced a formal alliance with Rockefeller Financial Services. They described it as a collaboration. What it actually represented was the merger of 2 of the oldest war financing operations in modern history. Their combined assets under management were measured in the tens of billions. Their influence reached into central banks, sovereign wealth funds, and multinational corporations across every continent. They did not need to start wars. They only needed wars to continue long enough to generate debt. And debt had become the dominant product of the global economy. This is not a conspiracy. This is a business model. Conflict generates borrowing. Borrowing generates interest. Interest generates wealth. Wealth generates power. Power generates the ability to ensure that conflicts continue. The incentive structure is perfect. The longer a war lasts, the more loans are issued. The more loans are issued, the more interest accumulates. The more interest accumulates, the less incentive there is to pursue peace. A war that ends in 6 months generates a fraction of the profit of a war that lasts 6 years. A Cold War that lasts 50 years generates compounding returns that dwarf any single conflict. The 20-year war in Afghanistan was not a failure. It was the business model working exactly as designed. Stage 5 is the modern iteration. You do not see the families anymore. You see the institutions, central banks, investment banks, sovereign wealth funds, defense contractors, private equity firms. The names have changed. The ownership has diffused across holding companies, trusts, and foundations. But the core mechanism remains identical. Governments borrow to fund conflicts, banks intermediate the borrowing, corporations supply the materials, the debt compounds, the wars continue. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Ukraine. Each conflict generates billions in reconstruction contracts, weapons sales, and sovereign debt issuances. The financial institutions underwriting these bonds are the direct descendants of the families who financed the Napoleonic Wars. The continuity is unbroken. You are living inside this system right now. Your government's national debt is the compounding residue of over a century of war financing. The United States alone holds over 34 trillion in debt. Much of that debt traces directly to conflicts financed through bonds sold by the same institutions that have been running this model since before World War I. When your government announces a new military intervention, it does not pay in cash. It borrows. When it borrows, banks collect. When banks collect, your taxes service the interest. You are not funding defense. You are funding a subscription to permanent conflict. The product is war. The payment plan is generational, and you were born into the contract. Here is the mechanism in plain terms. A government decides to intervene in a foreign conflict. It does not have the cash. It issues treasury bonds. Banks buy the bonds at auction. Those banks are often the same institutions that hold equity in defense contractors. The contractors receive government purchase orders. They manufacture weapons, vehicles, and technology. The government pays the contractors using money borrowed from the banks. The contractors generate profit, the banks collect interest, the government goes deeper into debt. The cycle repeats. Each repetition increases the total debt load. The interest payments become a permanent line item in the federal budget. In the United States, interest on the national debt now exceeds spending on education, infrastructure, or healthcare. You are paying for conflicts that ended before you were born. And you will continue paying for conflicts that have not started yet. The families who designed this system understood something foundational. You do not control people through force. You control them through debt. A population in debt cannot revolt. A government in debt cannot refuse. A nation in debt must continue borrowing to service existing obligations. The debt becomes a leash. The interest is the collar, and the wars are the mechanism that tightens it. This is why peace is never permanent. This is why conflicts reignite. This is why diplomatic solutions are always temporary. The system requires tension. Tension requires financing. Financing requires debt. Debt requires you. The historical record is not hidden. The Rothschild family financed British forces against Napoleon and simultaneously held interests in European coalitions opposing France. During World War I, banking syndicates led by Morgan and Rockefeller financed Allied powers while maintaining business relationships with German industrial firms through intermediaries. The same institutions that underwrote Allied war bonds also held investments in German chemical and manufacturing companies. When the war ended, they collected from both the victors and the reconstruction of the defeated. The documentation exists in congressional hearings, historical banking records, and the archives of the institutions themselves. This is not a theory. This is accounting. You cannot escape this system by ignoring it. You are already inside it. Every tax dollar you pay services debt issued to finance conflicts you had no vote on. Every inflation cycle you endure is the result of currency debasement required to manage unsustainable debt loads. Every interest rate hike you suffer is the central bank adjusting the cost of borrowing for governments that cannot stop. You are not a citizen. You are a revenue stream. The question is whether you understand what is extracting from you. Here is what you do next. First, recognize the pattern. Governments do not go to war and then figure out how to pay for it. They structure the financing first. If you see bond issuances increasing, military authorizations expanding, or central banks adjusting rates in preparation for increased borrowing, you are watching the prelude to conflict. The money is arranged before the justification is sold. Second, follow the debt. National debt is not an accident. It is the core product. When debt increases faster than GDP, it means the government is borrowing for purposes that do not generate economic return. War is the primary non-productive use of borrowed capital. If your government's debt is accelerating, it is financing something that does not build wealth. It is financing destruction. Third, understand that your currency is a claim on future taxation. When governments print money to avoid defaulting on debt, they are diluting your claim. Inflation is not a market phenomenon. It is a debt management tool. Protecting yourself means holding assets that cannot be debased, hard assets, productive assets, anything that holds value independent of government solvency. You do not need to quit the world. You need to stop playing this game on their terms. That means rejecting the narrative that war is necessary, rejecting the narrative that national security requires perpetual intervention, rejecting the idea that your taxes are funding safety when they are actually servicing interest payments to institutions that profit from instability. The system relies on your belief that the conflicts are real and the solutions are beyond your control. The moment you see the economic incentive behind the conflict, the illusion breaks. The business of permanent conflict is not a political question. It is a financial structure, and financial structures can be understood, mapped, and exited. The 5 families who pioneered this model are no longer 5 individuals in a room. They are a distributed network of institutions, holding companies, and sovereign relationships that span continents. But the core logic has not changed. Create dependency through lending. Escalate through financing. Lock in the debt through conflict. Extract through reconstruction. Repeat. You are living inside the loop. The only question is whether you are going to recognize it in time to protect yourself. If this opened your eyes to the cage you are living in, subscribe, because in the next video we dismantle the rest of the illusion.